So I'm talking about a different type of fatigue. This is more cognitive fatigue. So this is more a result of what happens more in relation to disease. So cognitive fatigue is one of the most common sequelae of neurological disorders. It's a huge problem for healthy older adults, individuals with neurodegenerative diseases, and other disease populations. So you can see from these bullets, it's very prevalent in a lot of different diseases. It's associated with decreased participation, satisfaction with life, and general quality of life, as well as an increased risk of functional decline, hospitalization, and mortality. In fact, cognitive fatigue has actually been proposed to be a physiological warning signal of impending disease events such as cerebrovascular disease and cardiac death. So what is cognitive fatigue and what are you looking for? So some have said it has to do with dysfunction within the prefrontal basal ganglia circuitry, specifically the non-motor function. And others in a similar vein have said that it may be due to a dopamine imbalance. Another line of research which has gained less support has been a neuroendocrine function. Specifically, it's hypothesized that the neuroanatomical position of the pituitary gland and its connection to the hypothalamus make it particularly vulnerable to mechanical injuries, such as the acceleration-deceleration injuries that take place with things like traumatic brain injury. There's also been a suggested link between the ApoE4 allele, but there hasn't been a lot of research in this area. So cognitive fatigue also has been thought to be due to this increased effort. So for example, there's this limited capacity framework where people have, you have this limited amount of resources, and as you increase your work, that results in the subjective experience of cognitive fatigue. So along these lines, there's something called the coping hypothesis, which proposes that reduced cognitive functioning leads to increased brain activity and effort, and this in turn results in the subjective experience of cognitive fatigue. Specific to older adults, there's this crunch hypothesis that proposes that processing inefficiencies in older adults cause the aging brain to recruit more resources than younger brains. And this allows older individuals to perform similarly to their younger counterparts at lower task demands, but the recruitment of these additional resources results in increased effort, which subsequently leads to increased subjective perceptions of fatigue. So the idea of you want to find ways of measuring this. But that's the most difficult part. So measuring fatigue has been one of the most challenging parts of it. In particular, people have not been able to find links, or very few links, between subjective and objective measures. And part of this is this whole idea of mental effort that I was talking about before. So what people have found is that studies have shown that there's this increased subjective experience of fatigue while you actually have improved performance or increased brain activity in areas that have been associated with fatigue. So what some have proposed is that subjective and objective fatigue and cognitive fatigue are actually two separate constructs, and anytime you do any kind of study or measurement of cognitive fatigue, you should try to include both. So just to kind of give you a short overview of both, in order to measure objective fatigue, there's been a couple of ways to operationalize it, but the one that's been most successful is when you measure cognitive fatigue during sustained mental effort. And in particular, there's two ways to study this that has kind of gained the most traction. Two types of categories. One is performance decrements when the central executive load or executive functioning is increased or maximized, like a dual task paradigm. And these are the kind of studies that have found the closest link between objective and subjective measures. And the second time is like a vigilance decrement. So when you kind of have, increased reaction time or performance variability over tasks that aren't that difficult. In terms of trying to measure subjective cognitive fatigue, one thing you want to note is that it's multidimensional. So at the very least, you want to separate out cognitive and physical fatigue, but even those are multidimensional. So for example, cognitive fatigue has recently been separated into 4 separate subscales: motivation, boredom, mental effort, and cognitive fatigue. Another way of measuring the subjective fatigue is using the PROMIS, NeuroQoL, or TBI-QoL measures. These don't measure out the multidimensional aspects of fatigue, but they were developed using advanced psychometric techniques and are adaptive and more sensitive to individuals' experience of fatigue. And finally, ecological momentary assessment is a promising avenue for measuring the state of subjective fatigue. This actually also lends itself to things like apps and other technology. This captures the state over multiple time points, sometimes over the course of a day. It hasn't been well studied yet, though, and it is tricky because the extra attention paid to capturing fatigue throughout the day may actually contribute to an individual's subjective experience of fatigue. So just quickly, I'll talk about treatment. There's 3 main categories: medications like neurostimulants, dopaminergic, caffeine, herbal; behavioral management techniques like taking breaks, delegating tasks to others, avoiding multitasking, improving sleep hygiene and time pressure management; and behavioral strategies like CBT for insomnia and fatigue, mindfulness-based stress reduction, aerobic exercises, and bright light therapy.